Hey folks, welcome to Not So Tech. This is a channel where I talk to you about interesting tech careers beyond software engineering and how to get them. In this first of the 4 video series, I'm going to talk to you about interview tips and how to crack a program manager interview. In this video, we're going to talk about case-based interviews or hypothetical interviews where you're going to be coming up with solutions to situations that you've never seen before. These are typically questions where the interviewer is looking for your ability to think through what a program manager does, which we spoke about in the first video, so please check out that if you already haven't. So what they're looking for is your ability to think through complex factors in a very, very different ambiguous situation that you might not have encountered. And they're actually going to give you a situation based on what they know your experiences are to test your ability to come up with a structured solution in new context, right? And that is exactly what a program manager does, right? Be it strategy, planning, execution, communication, stakeholder management, and looking ahead and so on and so forth. So the kind of or the flavor of questions that you can expect over here will always be on the lines of hypotheticals. So for example, if you're interviewing with Facebook, the question could be on the lines of, let's assume that you need to set up a data center in Indonesia. How would you go about doing that? Let's assume that you're interviewing with Twitter, and the question could be on the lines of, you have this community program that's very successful in North America, and now you need to expand this to Western Europe. How would you go about doing that, right? So these are the kind of questions that you can expect where there's not truly a right answer, but all that people are checking is your ability to think through very, very different factors which are critical to what a program manager does, right? Before we get started, please take a moment to subscribe to my channel. I'd really appreciate it. Tip number 1, get a favorite framework. So as I spoke about, we need to think of very complex factors in a very short amount of time, right? So it's essentially the time between the interviewer asking their question and you taking those 30 seconds to jot down your solution. And in those 30 seconds, it's really difficult for any of us to think through all the factors in a new context, right? So for that, what is extremely helpful is to have a favorite framework which can help you think through those different factors in that moment. So stick to it. So for example, I have modified the GTM framework, which is the go-to-market framework, and I use it to my advantage in any interview. And you don't need to state out that I'm using this framework in the interview, right? You just need to think through it in your head, structure that solution and present that structure to your interviewer, and I'm sure they'll be impressed by it. Tip number 2, don't use this as an excuse to talk about past incidents, right? One of the biggest mistakes that you can make in a hypothetical case-based interview is to keep connecting it to your past experiences. As I said, the interviewer is actively looking for your ability to come up with new solutions in a new situation. And in such a case, the biggest mistake that you can make is to keep talking about something that you've done in the past. Tip number 3, make assumptions and clearly state them. As I said, a key thing that they're checking in this interview is your ability to think through complex factors, right? And in such a case, you can ask them maybe a couple of clarifying questions, maybe 1 to 2 or max 3 clarifying questions. But don't bombard the interviewer with 10 or 15 different clarifying questions. It's essentially a red flag because they think that they're spoon feeding you the answer. In such a case, because you want to impress the interviewer with your ability to think through different factors, make your assumptions clearly about various factors, be it say market sizing, be it the target audience, be it the launch strategy, and so on and so forth, and just clearly state. Tip number 4, have an objective and connect it throughout. As a program manager, since you are responsible for the end-to-end execution of any program, looking for your ability to have a clear business and a technical objective that you're driving throughout the life cycle of the program, right? So have a clear objective that you state at the very start, and be it when you're talking about the communication or the stakeholder strategy or the risk mitigation strategy, keep connecting to that objective and how the part of the framework that you're talking about connects to your core objective. And this will save your interviewer the mental or the cognitive overload of having to connect it on your behalf. And they know that you're very clear in your objectives by stating it and sticking to it throughout the program and ensuring the success of it. Tip number 5, tell them how you've mitigated risks. A very critical part of being a program manager, as we've spoken about earlier, is looking ahead and thinking through factors that nobody else has seen just yet, right? So give them a clear risk mitigation strategy. Don't just keep talking about how your solution is perfect, but rather how your solution has a certain set of risks, but that you as a program manager know how to mitigate those, and you've given the plan for that, right? Along with that, have a very clear indication of where your strategy or where your plan could fail, right? And just tell them how you think it could be mitigated instead of just saying that your plan is bulletproof, because we all know that's not always true. Tip number 6, tell them that you can go in more depth if needed. Let's assume you have a 40-minute program manager interview in which you'll get 2 questions. 5 minutes are spent in getting to know the interviewer, 5 minutes are spent in understanding the question, asking clarifying questions. So you essentially have 30 minutes for giving your solution and having follow-up answers for 2 questions, which is 15 per question, right? And in that, assuming you have 5 to 7 parts to your answer, So what my recommendation is to spend 45 seconds to 1 minute on one part of your framework and clearly state to the interviewer that there are these other things that I'm not talking about so that we can cover a wide range of things. But if you want, I can go in more depth if needed. And that will keep it one, a two-way conversation where your interviewer actively feels included as a part of the conversation. And two, it clearly shows your ability to go in more depth if needed. And that is what a good program manager does. Tip number 7, be ready for follow-ups and don't get too defensive. The first part is don't keep talking about your solution throughout the interview. Keep it a two-way conversation so that there could be room for follow-ups and it can be a healthy conversation that you have and you also learn something from that interview. The second part of it is, and this is something that you need to be very careful of, is to not get too attached or defensive about your solution or too aggressive about it. So this is a solution that you've thought through in the last 15 minutes, and of course it's important that you defend it in the most logical and the rational way wherever it's needed. But at the same time, don't get too attached to it and get too aggressive about defending it to the extent where it seems like that you are not even open to feedback or you're a not good collaborator, because that could be a big red flag. So always be mindful to have a two-way conversation and make sure that you engage in that conversation meaningfully and you're open to changing the course of your answer if needed when you're hearing a logical point. Tip number 8, and this is critical, right? Have a clear measurement strategy, which is that when you've stated the entire answer, you want people to know or you want your interviewer to know how you're going to be successful. So when you're stating your objective very clearly, also have a clear metric in mind, which you're going to be measuring that objective through, and measure that throughout your framework in some way. And lastly, when you're ending your answer, just clearly state on how your objective is met because of this particular metric. So those are all my tips for a program manager case plus interview. In the next set of videos, we'll talk about other kind of interview questions that you face as a program manager. Meanwhile, please take a moment to subscribe to my channel. I'd really appreciate it, and see you soon.